Welcome to the Blood Flow Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Hamill. I'm a physician specialized in blood circulation and a writer based in Paris. Today, my guest is Georgia Hunter. Georgia is a writer whose work has been featured in places like the New York Times Book Review, Literary Hub, and multiple other publications. She started out as a freelance copywriter in the world of adventure travel. Her first novel, We Were the Lucky Ones, was published in 2017. Since then, it has sold over 1 million copies and it's been translated in over 20 languages. It's also been adapted by Hulu as a miniseries, for which Georgia serves as a co-executive producer. Georgia, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So we'll talk about the show, we'll talk about the book, but I want to start out at the moment when you became aware of your family history. Can you tell us how old you were, where you were living at the time, what was the context?
Yeah, sure. So We Were the Lucky Ones is based entirely on my family story, my grandfather and his siblings. But I had no idea growing up that story existed. And even though I lived really close to my grandparents, Addie, who you meet in the book, I knew him as Eddie, and Caroline, we also meet in the book. I grew up in a very small town in Massachusetts, in New England. And we lived a mile apart. And so we spent a lot of time together. But, the war years were just not a part of my grandfather's dialogue. We talked about everything. And he was a very upbeat, charismatic, forward-thinking guy. Quirky, now that I look back on it. Lots of kind of maybe hints about his European upbringing, but never raised his family in the Jewish faith, never talked about the Holocaust. And so that was a discovery I made a year after he died. He passed away when I was 14. And the next year, a high school English teacher assigned us a project called an eye search, where we were asked to go out and interview a relative. And that's when I sat down with my grandmother, Caroline, and I discovered that piece of his story. And I actually dug up the paper and I found it. Yeah, I found it. Look, this is my little
amazing.
It came out of that project. So yeah, it was quite a discovery to make at that age. You're middle school and kind of figuring out who you are. And the purpose of it wasn't just to unearth your roots, but to kind of understand how your ancestry impacts who you are today. And so I just reread it, actually, and it's funny reading my 15-year-old prose. But it really was, eye-opening for me. I think it sparked a lot of curiosity, and the more stories I heard about my grandfather, I did a lot of, I didn't just ask my grandmother, I asked, my mom and her sister and her brother for memories, and I learned a lot about not just his experience during the Holocaust, but traits that I never knew about him. I only knew him in his later years, and he was quite sick with Parkinson's. So, the charisma and the resourcefulness and the humor and the he was silly, but he was also very strict. I mean, he had this very kind of unique personality. So I feel like I came to know him through that paper, and it sparked a lot of questions, a lot of curiosity.
What were some of the European traits now that you look back?
The food, he hated ketchup. He thought it was like a chemical product, and he would refuse to use it in his house. He only ate dark chocolate, which ideally he would bring back from a trip to Switzerland. Manners were very important to him. And he also didn't like if you responded with a yeah or uh-huh. It was always a yes. No, yes, this is what I'm going to be doing. Or he was super resourceful too. And perhaps that's more just like a wartime trait than specifically European, but he made so many of the things in his home by hand. And I kind of just took it for granted at the time, but he had built a loom in his basement, and on the loom, he wove the curtains that hung in the living room. He had these clay busts that he made by hand of two of his children, taken from a photograph that his brother Jacob had taken as inspiration. He had art from all over the world that he collected. He had all these like trinkets, and he was always like trying to make things, improve things. So like he didn't like that when you have a soap dish by the sink, say, that the soap becomes slimy, right? That's not okay, apparently, in his world. So he created this contraption in his bathroom where he would embed magnets into his soap bars, and then he would hang a chain with a magnet up, just over the sink so that the soap would dangle and would not sit in a pool of water and get slimy. So those were the little things, and I just thought they were cool at the time. But looking back, kind of speaks.
Sure, when you're a kid, you don't think about it, and also, I guess, not wasting things was probably one of them, right?
Very much so. My grandma.
That's probably just a war thing. Actually.
I think so. Yeah, growing up in that era and knowing what definition is. Yeah.
So, what do you remember about the school presentation? Now that you've reread your little paper, do you remember do you have to read it out loud in front of the class? Do you remember some of the reactions at the time, or how you felt reading it?
I remember being proud of the story because as I came to know it, I felt like it was quite a feat for my grandfather. And I didn't even know about the other family in Poland. I hadn't uncovered their stories yet. So I just knew that my grandfather was able to get out of Europe, and he had kind of an adventurous World War II story. And I knew it was very different from any Holocaust history that I had learned about so far. And so I was excited and proud to share it. My teacher gave me a good grade. I got an A. He said I did a very nice job. He said he really liked reading it and listening to it, but that I needed to work on my sourcing better. I needed to source my material better. I'm like, okay.
We'll talk about research.
Yeah, we'll talk about the research part. So no, I don't have vivid memories. I have much stronger memories of the interview itself than I do of presenting the piece in that class. But I went back to Providence, which is where I was in school at the time in Rhode Island, for a book talk when the book came out in 2017. And my teacher came to one of my events. Nice. And so it was fun to have him there in the audience and have it come full circle. He had to sit and talk again.
And so did you have more conversations with your grandmother after this one? Or was it just one-off?
Yeah, no, it became like a topic of conversation, and I would ask questions, and I wasn't obsessed over it or anything. It was just, it was in the back of my mind, I think. And certainly, and I talked with, like, again, my aunt, my uncle, my cousins, kind of just to see what they knew. And yeah, it wasn't like a one-shot deal. It was definitely sparked a lot of questions.
Mm. So we'll jump ahead a little bit. 6 years after this talk with your grandmother, so suppose in between you went to college, did other things, but you talked about it in other interviews about this family reunion where you had all these cousins and aunts and uncles from all over the world, and that's where you heard about the war again, more war stories that you weren't aware of. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, exactly. It was the year 2000, and I had just graduated from college. And I was 21 years old, and my mother's one of 10 first cousins on her father's side. So she invited them all to come to our home on Martha's Vineyard, which is a little island off of Massachusetts. And they all immediately agreed to come, which I think surprised her a little bit, but they all descended upon this little island from France and Israel and Brazil and California and Miami and Vermont and all over Chicago. And we had this incredible week together. I met relatives who I'd never met before, and we prepared all these different kinds of foods, and there were 4 languages being spoken at once, always music in the house. It was really lively and fun. And then one night of that reunion, I wandered out back to where my mom and her cousins were sitting around a table after dinner, picnic table, and I realized that they were telling stories about the war. And that's when I got kind of my first introduction to the greater Quartz family narrative. So they were all, that second generation survivors, and they were all telling stories about their parents. And they were unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Jose was there and talked about the fact that he was born in the Siberian Gulag. And his parents said that it was so cold. He was born sometime in March, and it was so cold he'd wake as a baby with his eyes frozen shut, and his mom would have to coax them open with her breast milk. Like little details like that. I think imagining you're 21 years old and sitting there, I was like, what? Anna talked about her mother, Helena, hiked over the Austrian Alps to safety at the end of the war and happened to be pregnant at the time. They heard about an illegal wedding, a very dangerous wedding at the start of the war, and a blacked out home in Lvov, and a mother-daughter escape from the ghetto, and false IDs, and a disguised circumcision, and all these things come back in the book and also in the series. But I
Yeah.
remember the time thinking, like, these are outrageous stories. Like, there's someone needs to write them down. And
And at that time, were you already destined to be a writer? What had you studied in college?
no, I studied psychology. I loved my writing
Really?
courses. I took creative writing, and I always wrote for fun, sort of more personally, for like travel writing or in my journal. But no, I didn't know what I wanted to be yet. And I was actually off to like the Sydney Olympics that year, and didn't really have a plan except that I loved the travel world, and I thought maybe I would try to dip my toe into that world when I got back. And so yeah, it was really just the family story seeded somewhere deep down, I think, in my gut, and it percolated there until I couldn't quite ignore it any longer. And that was an 8-year process, though. I mean, it took me a while to put that stake in the ground and say, okay, like this is something I really want to do. So it was 2008 when I set off to unearth and record the family story.
Mhm. And was that a yearly reunion after that? After
Yeah,
2000? Did you
yeah.
see everyone every year like that?
Yeah, we try every year or every other year, whether it's a family reunion or a bat mitzvah or a wedding. Yeah, we're always getting together. And I just saw the whole family in DC, 32 of us from all over the world came for
Nice.
our screening, and any excuse that we have, we get together.
And at that 2000 reunion, who do we meet in the book that was still alive at the time?
Yeah, so we have one living relative who, and thankfully she was still living. She just passed this past January, actually,
Oh,
Felicia.
sorry.
So yeah, thank you. She was a year old at the start of the war. So she's the oldest of those cousins, and the only one of her generation with firsthand memories. So she was there that night, and she, the stories that were shared were told so anecdotally and with a lot of levity and distance, and clearly I think that was first generation's way of protecting second generation and sharing that. I'm sure they were shared that way in order to spare the children those more horrific details. So I have a video of Felicia demonstrating how when she was in hiding in the convent, she was maybe 4 or 5 years old, and she had to pretend to be a little Catholic girl, and she had changed her name to Barbara. And she said that her mother would try to come and visit her when she could, but she was only allowed so many visits. So sometimes she would come and just stand at the fence and like wave to her. And she said she demonstrated how she would go pretend to tie her shoes so that she could kind of look between her legs and wave to her mother, like, and so no one could see. We actually have the side by side of that and the scene from the series, because we capture that moment in the series in the book
Okay.
too. So it was really powerful to hear her stories. And at the end of that evening out on the back porch on Martha's Vineyard, she was the one that looked around at everybody and said, it's a miracle that we're all here today. And then she said, we were the lucky ones.
Mhm.
That obviously stuck with me.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to go back now to the research. So I guess not back, but forward to 2008 when you started the research. Because I was looking at your website, and one part of it that I really liked is you give research tips for people who also want to record their family history, dig up family history. So during your own research, at what point did you realize that you couldn't do everything from your computer and that you had to go out there and travel and meet people, visit the towns? What was the process like?
Yeah, and I think I knew right away that I wanted to interview as many relatives as I could. And this was really before Zoom, and I suppose I could have gotten on the phone with them, but instinctively I knew I wanted to be in person for as many interviews as I could. However, as I've kind of talked about, we're a super global family, so I knew it would require a lot of travel. So my husband and I, he traveled with me on all of my research adventures. And so we really traded in our budgets and our vacation days for 2 years and spent that time traveling around. And I had my little digital voice recorder and my moleskin notebook, and I would spend 3, 4, sometimes a week, 3, 4 days or a week with relatives in their homes and just hearing stories and asking as many questions as I could possibly think of. And not necessarily like, how did your parents survive? But tell me about them as people, and what were their quirks, and what were their imperfections, and what was their favorite food, and what did they like to wear, and what brand of cigarettes did they smoke? Like all of it. I wanted to know every detail. So I knew I wanted to visit them in person. I wasn't sure about going back to Poland at first. It made me a little bit nervous. Just none of the family went back after the war, and the statistics are horrible as they are across Poland. But in Rodham, where my family's from, it's insane how at the beginning of the war, there were 30,000 Jews, made up about a third of the population. And by the end of the war, there were fewer than 300 survivors. And so I had a very haunting image of what this town would feel like and be like. But I did, in the end, decide, I don't know, part of it was just curiosity. I wanted to see the places where my grandfather had been and his siblings had been, see the place where they grew up. I did follow in their footsteps along their paths, their journeys. And the other part of it was, as a writer, I think you start to crave the details for settings. And
Sure.
I'd never been to Poland. I'd never, followed this specific route through Europe. So I'm so glad I went. And I honestly, my first impression of the town of Rodham was just how beautiful it was. It was so quaint and welcoming, and the cobblestone streets and the wrought iron, balconies and the street lamps and the poppy flowers. And so I think it was really helpful for me to see what life might have been like before everything was turned upside down for them. And I had a wonderful guide, and he took us around. And so, yeah, I'm so glad. I really encourage anybody who's interested in not necessarily even unearthing every detail of their family story, but just imagining what it was like for their ancestors to go to the place where they spent time and stand there and just like breathe it in and soak it up.
Sure.
Yeah.
Did you find the family apartment?
You did, yeah. I
Yeah.
have pictures of it. I think I have it on my website. I have, pictures there. So apparently, for some reason, a lot of the Jews in town, the doorways to their buildings were arched, and that's how you knew that the family that lived inside was Jewish. Now, my family didn't live in the old Jewish quarter. They were sort of more assimilated and lived outside, but their doorway was still arched. So I spent a lot of time walking in and out of that doorway. I didn't get the courage to go. They were on the second floor. I didn't get the courage to go knock on the door, but there's a courtyard back behind it. And yeah, I spent a lot of time in that doorway. Probably thought I was a little crazy.
So how was it? Did you just not get the courage to go up and knock, or?
I just felt it was an intrusion of privacy. I don't know. I didn't speak the language. We didn't have our guide with us at that time. Like I had the address and I had found it. And I, there's also something, I had stories of what the interior looked like, and the bathtub and the piano. And I also didn't want to be disappointed by what I found. Like I grew up in the same home from zero, literally born in my house in Massachusetts until 17 when I went to college. And I remember driving by it later, and they had like repainted it, and I don't know. I just didn't love. I wanted to keep my memories preserved.
Actually, both things have happened to me.
Really?
Yeah, the house where I grew up, and I actually got to visit it because I was just standing in front, and the people told me to come in. And
Really?
they were super welcoming. So it was very weird to see like my old basketball rim was there and everything. So and the same thing visiting with my grandmother in her village. She came with us, and so we found the apartment, actually the building, because they owned the whole building where they were living. And so we went up, me and my cousins, my American cousins, we went up and we actually knocked at some doors, and a lot of them wouldn't let us in. In Germany.
I probably feared that too. It was Germany where your grandma?
Yeah. But on the last floor, the people let us in, so we took a look around. But my grandmother, she didn't come. She stayed outside. She said, I want to preserve my memories.
Wow. That must have been so powerful being there with her. I can't even imagine.
Yeah, it was amazing because she was the guest of honor of the village, actually, because some school kids had made a project about her family.
Wow. Oh, that's incredible.
And the whole family was there with her, like Americans and French.
Oh, amazing. I hope you have that documented, photographs.
Yeah, I do.
What an incredible experience. I wish I had been able to go with my grandparents. That would be a remarkably moving experience, I think.
It was, yeah, it was quite special. So yeah, I see what you mean. It must have been amazing just being there. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, absolutely. It allowed me to imagine what life was like. And that was really important for me.
And have you been getting letters from readers or visitors to the website who have gone through this journey themselves and maybe using the tips you give on the website?
Yeah, that's one of the most rewarding bits of feedback I could ever get is when someone reaches out and says, you've inspired me to sit down with my grandmother or my aunt or uncle or cousin or anybody in their family to learn a little bit about their own roots. So yeah, I get people a lot. And I think because the story is so broad, my grandfather's is, touches on Africa and then Brazil, and then we have Siberia and we have all over Poland. And I think people have lots of different entry points into it, which is kind of cool. So I hear from a lot of people who can connect to it in like various stages, which is really rewarding.
Very cool. I want to go back a little bit to when you started writing, because you said you studied psychology, but you also been writing for a long time. Do you remember how old you were when you wrote your first story and how you felt when you finished it?
Yeah, I remember writing a piece, I think I was 11, that got published in my little local newspaper.
Wow.
And it was a big horse gal, and it somehow involved bringing my horse inside the end of the world. I don't know. It was, I don't know. It was a very bizarre, looking back, subject, but I remember the pride in seeing it in the newspaper. I thought that was really cool. And I mean, it was all props to my parents. I mean, obviously they submitted it. I don't think I would have asked to be in the newspaper, but I think maybe there was a contest. I don't even remember. I do also have very strong memories of my father typing away at a book that he was writing when I was about 3. So some of my earliest memories are hearing his typewriter upstairs in our house and the bam, 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 bam. And then about a year and a half later, holding that book in my hands. So I had these little like touch points of like, oh, you can write things and then they can get published. Now I know how impossibly hard that whole process is. But to have the, experience as a young child, seeing my father doing it successfully and having a couple of pieces published as a little, as a youngster, it felt good. I will say though, it wasn't like that one article then set me off on a trajectory to want to publish things. Like I definitely felt, again, I think I mentioned like my writing was very personal for a very long time, very journalistic, like writing in my journal. And I loved to write about my travels, but I never had any intent of sharing it with anybody.
So let's go back to Felicia, because that was your first stop, I think, or one of the first stops when you started the research. And so it was in Paris, where I am now.
Yes.
Did you, before that family reunion in 2008, were you in touch, or was that a kind of a new relationship for you?
I had met her. And again, I had not met all of the cousins, but I had met a few. I'd met her, I'd met Helena, but very briefly, and my memories are very vague because I was young. So really spending time with her and her husband, Louis, in their home was a first for me. I mean, that I'd never done that before. And they were so gracious. We spent days with them. And I remember being quite nervous going into her interview because I wasn't sure. Again, she had the memories as a child, and you can just imagine as, her entire childhood was consumed with the Holocaust and being in hiding or being hunted or skirting death. And I'd heard bits and pieces of her story, but I didn't know what she'd be willing or able to share. So I was pretty bowled over by her courage and also by the vividness of her memories. Like people ask me all the time, like, Felicia's stories, did she tell you those? Are those real? Or are those from Mila? And they're all from Felicia and they're all her own. It's wild. Like when you think back, like your earliest memories, mine are like 5 or 6, like 5 maybe.
No, it's amazing. It's amazing. Yeah. You see them. Yeah. I mean, I haven't seen the whole TV show, but I've read the book, and yeah, amazing what she went through. Yeah.
Able
Crazy.
to remember, I know, and willing to share because I feel like I've met enough, third generation survivors like myself, people who are going out and asking questions. And perhaps there's something about that, like skipping a generation where there's enough distance and also having a little bit more curiosity and willingness to ask the questions that were hard to ask before. And from what I've heard is you either fall into the camp of like the families that are like really embracing and wanting to tell the story. And then those are like, no, that's past and we're not going to revisit that. And I completely respect both. I just feel so lucky that my family was we're going to embrace it and tell you everything we know. And then you get to piece it all together and try to make sense of it.
And had she shared all of this with the other members of the family before?
Yeah, she had shared it with her side of the family, and she had done a Shoah interview with Steven Spielberg's foundation. And there was at one point a woman who wanted to write her story, who had written a bunch down. So yeah, she was willing to share it, which was.
And so during your conversation with her, with the other survivors, so people who have seen really what humans can do to each other, did you ever mention the present or the future, either of the Jewish people or just the world in general, or was it really mainly focusing on history?
I was mainly looking back at the time, and remember it was like 2008, 2009, so a very different world than we're in today. Sadly, everything feels incredibly relevant at this moment in time. So I'm sure the conversations would be quite different if I started my research today. But I do remember Felicia especially being very vocal about this is my story and we must never forget. And very much a we, not specifically her story, but the stories of the Holocaust. And so, and I think everybody believed that it was more important now than ever to tell the stories, to preserve them, because eventually, look where we are now. There are fewer and fewer survivors left to share, and they weren't really at that phase yet. Of Felicia is the first of her 10 first cousins to pass away, but that was years ago. So I think they weren't really thinking about not being around so much, but just the fact that the stories often are not told, and that it's important for history, to not repeat itself. And so let's learn from what we've done. Let's learn from our mistakes. Let's tell personal stories that people can embrace and relate to.
Yeah, and what was the reaction within the family when you told everyone that you were trying to record this and eventually write it as a book? Or was the idea of the novel there already, or was it something that you just wanted to do and then you said, I might write it as a novel? What is the process like?
Yeah, no, they were so supportive. I reached out to everybody. Well, first I told my mom, and I said, Mom, I think I want to do this, because she had spent like a little bit of time gathering up my grandfather's condolence letters and thinking maybe she would write a story on Addie, like on that chapter of the Court's family narrative. And when I came to her and said, I think I want to tell like the greater story, and I didn't know it would be a book. I didn't know it would be historical fiction. Certainly didn't know it would ever have a life on a screen. But I said, I'd like to try to capture the whole story, and it's going to require a lot. Like I might have to quit my day job and like really do this and like try to freelance on the side if I'm going to try to make this work. And I kind of thought she might say like, you're crazy, don't quit your day job. But she was so supportive. And I have this binder that she had made with photos and those letters. And she had like ran into the other room and like gave it to me. And it felt like a passing of the baton in a way. And actually, interestingly, I opened that up and it was January 13th, I believe. And the date and to the exact like hour, I looked, the first thing in that binder was my grandfather's the program for his memorial service. And it was literally the exact day and time of his memorial service, like 15 years ago. I mean, I was like,
That's
okay, I'll do it.
No choice now.
No choice now. So once I got her approval and also my husband, because I was like, like this, I think we were just.
What was your day job at that point?
I was in the world of marketing and branding, and I was a strategist. So I was sort of communicating in between our clients and our, the creative teams, and I really liked it. It was fun, and I hadn't yet done the travel writing, so that's when I sort of got inspired to say, okay, I'll try the travel writing, and I'll do that, as a consultant on the side and make my own hours. and had the support of my husband, which was incredible. Like I couldn't have done it without him. Also cheering me on. And so when I got my mom's kind of thumbs up and my husband's thumbs up, and then I sent an email to the family and I said, I'd like to do this, but only with your approval and with your support. And they all embraced it. So
Well, that's great.
yeah.
I'd like to talk also about the writing process, because there was the research that probably, I suppose, took years,
Yeah.
with all the traveling and everything. At what point did you actually sit down to write the novel? Were you doing it as you were traveling, or did you do everything and then sit down to
Yeah,
write it?
it was very sort of haphazard in the beginning, where I'd come home from an interview and I'd have heard crazy story and I would just write it. I'd be like, I'd try to write the scene, imagine how it would have unfolded in real life. And so for, I don't know, a couple years, like 2008, 2009, I had these like one-off chapters that I'd saved in a file, but there were like 20, 30 of them. They're like these one-off scenes, and it was very unorganized, which is not like me. And I think I realized at some point this story is so huge that I'm going to have to organize it. So I did, alongside writing scenes now and then, create a timeline, and I color coded it by sibling. So it's like this beautiful rainbow of a document with like who was where and when. And I was really struck by that because you could see they were doing such different things at the exact same time in all over, like across 4 continents, like just the way they were surviving at the same time in different places and not knowing where the others were. Like, so that was helpful for me. And then as I finally, I kind of told enough people about the idea and kind of got convinced that it could take the shape of a book. I thought, well, and start to finish, it was 9 years, and most of those years were research. And I thought, well, I've done so much research. Why don't I write it as nonfiction, narrative nonfiction? Because I'm not going to veer from the story. The goal is to preserve the family story for my kids and their kids and so on, and to honor the relatives, right? So I'm not going to like fictionalize any of it. So I went down that path, and I'm sure as a writer, like, actually, I'm curious if it's different in France. Here, if you pitch a nonfiction book, it's a very different process than pitching a novel. You have to write what's called a proposal, and you have to create an outline with chapter summaries for how your book is going to unfold. As opposed to a novel, you just turn in your first 50 pages, and if they like it, you send the manuscript. So that forced me to write an outline with chapter summaries. And that was really hard, but it's probably the best thing I ever did, to organize my thoughts and the timeline. And I knew I had to write it chronologically because it would be too confusing otherwise. There's so many storylines and so much happening. So that was sort of the progression, the collecting of the research, also collecting from databases around the world, anything, when I ran out of like people to talk to, I'd reach out to archives and ministries and magistrates.
Yeah, you explained that on the website. It's very interesting. All these groups that exist around the world, people just helping you and showing you stuff. It's great.
Incredible. It's amazing when you ask. So just ask. You just like, there are people out there who are very into like specific things, and whether it was like Anders's army that my great uncle Gennick fought for, or the Siberian peace, or North Africa where my grandfather was. Like there were these little rabbit holes I went down, and people who helped guide me along the way. So I was doing that, collecting the oral histories, but the progression of like the timeline to then the chapter summaries. Then I had to kind of push pause on writing these like quick one-off things and say, okay, I need to start writing in order and really organize my thoughts here. And so that.
So did you rewrite the chapters, or did you just keep some and just?
Yeah, I would like drop them in, or like, oh, I'm at the scene now where like Mila and Felicia try to escape the ghetto. Let me like put, that page of prose that I had written when I came back from Paris. Let me drop that in and see if that worked. And and I would go back and listen to my interviews as well, and read my notes and read other memoirs and watch documentaries and try to kind of really immerse in all of it, the era.
And did you find it was a little bit limiting in your freedom as a writer? Because I guess one of the pleasures when you're writing is finding inspiration, inventing details. Or were you still able to fill in? I suppose there were many blanks, either in a monologue or Where were you able to put new details in that you hadn't found?
Yeah, well, this is a great question. And in the end, I did decide to write it as historical fiction rather than nonfiction. And that was partly because I didn't have those creative details, like the colorful details, like you mentioned, like the thoughts in their heads, their dialogue, the weather that day, what they were wearing. I suppose if I'd been able to interview more relatives with who had firsthand memories, perhaps I could have felt comfortable with that. I did, but I just didn't. I didn't feel right saying this is what they said and how they felt. So that's really where the creative license came in. And I think, I love historical fiction because I feel like you just kind of get lost in a story while learning about a time or a place or people. And so for me, adding those colorful details was really fun and brought it, in a way closer to the truth, because again, those stories had been passed down with in a very black and white way, or with a lot of levity or with a lot of stoicism. But putting yourself in the shoes of your relatives in that moment and trying to imagine what it was actually like there's the scene with the disguised circumcision, and that was told with a lot of laughter. And then he did an egg and a Band-Aid, and then everyone's laughing. And I'm writing the scene and I'm realizing like there's nothing funny in that moment.
Yes, if that goes wrong, there's nothing funny about it.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I leaned into those, like the connective tissue. The bones were there. Nothing. It didn't make up any bit of the narrative or how they survived. Occasionally, I'd have to create a character that like linked to another character, or I'd have to create somebody for my grandfather to talk to, so that he could have some dialogue. And so I knew there were soldiers when he was in the Polish column of the French army, and I created Cyrus. And for Genik, he has a friend Otto in Siberia. I imagined they had friends, or they made friends with people there, but I didn't hear about them. I didn't know about them. So I would create those characters in order to have a little bit of continuity and open up some dialogue and add a little bit of depth there. But aside from that, I really stayed hard and true to the story, which was challenging, but also like reassuring, because I didn't have to make up the plot. Like it was a very nice thing to, like, as an author, to be like, all right, the story's there. You just have to uncover it and then do your best to honor it.
And as you were writing, once you sat down, were you also showing your writing to expert readers around the world that you'd met, maybe people who would help you with the research? Or did you just feel comfortable just writing the whole thing, and because you've done so much research?
Yeah, no. I shared it with 3 historians, like experts in the field of Holocaust and Polish Holocaust specifically. So that I am not, I'm a family historian. I'm not a historian, and I'm not an expert in World War II. I learned so much in my research, but I certainly wanted fact checkers to look it through and read it. That came a bit later, though. I mean, my earliest readers, because it's so personal and it was new to me and I was nervous about sharing it. So my first 3 readers were like in my very tight circle. They were my mother, my husband, and a dear friend. So I got the courage to send the manuscript to them, and they gave me really nice feedback, which was nice. But then I realized, and constructive, feedback, I was also able to make the manuscript better. But then I thought, well, they kind of like me, and they also know I've spent like 8 years of my life researching the story. Are they going to really tell me they don't like it?
Exactly. That's a hard question.
Totally. So then a friend said, well, she worked in publishing. She's like, I've got a friend who's a consultant in the editing world, and she could look at it. She's an editor. Would you like to send it to her? And I thought, okay, perfect. I'll do that on my own dime, and I'll get someone else's opinion. So I sent it to her, and she really liked it. And so that's when I was like, okay, well, if she really likes it, and she gave me some nice feedback as well, and I incorporated that. And then she actually, the publishing world here is very small and very personal. So she was like, I just feel like I know a couple of agents who have been waiting for something like this to come across their plate. Could I reach out on your behalf? And I was like, yes, absolutely. And interestingly, I had done my own research on agents and made my nerdy list of like my reaches, my A list, my B list, my C list. And I think she wanted to reach out to 5, and all 5 of them were on my A list. And I remember being like, whoa, like
Nice.
let's start with the C list and like get rejected first and then climb up the ladder. And she's like, no, let me just, and sure enough, one of those agents is now my like dear friend and agent. So I got lucky in that sense that because it's as a first time author, it's hard to get your work seen. They call it the slush pile. Like, the agents get so many submissions. So to have a friend in the industry say, "Hey, I think you should read this," was
Sure, yeah. Well, here it's different. You just send it to the publisher and
oh, right
with
to the
no agent, and then you wait 4 months and you get a letter. No thanks. So it
interesting.
takes a lot of patience too,
We do that to the agents. Like we send to the agents and wait
right?
a month and then get the
Go
rejection.
straight to the student reading all the slush pile.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
And what while you're writing, before you're done, do you sometimes read your book out loud to yourself to see if the dialogue sounds right? Is that something
I
you've
do.
done, or
Yeah,
it's to someone?
I do. No, not to someone. Oh gosh, no.
Oh no.
In the privacy of my room or my office, yeah, early drafts at least. And I mean, maybe in a final draft, I'd read it out loud to someone, but I've never done that before. I should. That would be good because then you hear it a little differently when people are listening. Like
Yeah.
when I hear my audiobook, I hear the words differently than when I read it, out loud. Or read it on the screen. Yeah, I read it out loud. I do still. My father was a writer and also an actor. And so that was one of his techniques. And he always encouraged me to do that. So I think do you do that? I think it's really helpful.
I definitely do that, and I get good feedback.
Yeah.
Like I do it along the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, it doesn't sound right. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't do it to myself. I do it to my girlfriend, and she's like, "No, the chapter's not done.
That's
No, this doesn't sound right."
Yeah. That's
I,
great. You're brave.
yeah, it's very helpful. Yeah.
Super helpful.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Georgia, so much for taking the time. It's been really, really interesting. And I'll put the links to everything in the show notes, your website, the trailer for the show. People can see it in France very soon. And also, there's a link for your grandfather's music, which is really beautiful. I've listened to it yesterday, so people can check it out. So once again, your book is called We Were the Lucky Ones, and it's available everywhere books are sold. It's translated in over 20 languages, so people can find it. And the miniseries is available for now on Hulu. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Sorry, this was the Blood Flow podcast, and we'll see you soon.